The Bible is generative, not definitive. The Bible is not meant to define faith, but generate faith. The Bible isn't meant to collect beliefs, but to evoke a way of seeing and a way of living. I've said this before. I can think of a few years ago when I had a sermon on the Beatitudes, and I said that the Beatitudes are not meant to be the end of the Beatitudes. That would be that they're only the Beatitudes in Matthew and Luke. They are meant to be examples. Seen this way, we can come up with our own Beatitudes. The title of that sermon was, "Blessed are the slow, for they will get to the kingdom of God." Blessed are the disabled, for they will know who they are. Blessed are the immigrants, for they will find a way home. Blessed are the essential workers, for they will find rest in God. The same is true of parables. It isn't that Jesus had a definitive set of parables that he knew would someday become the Holy Scriptures. Christianity changed when it entered the Greek world. The Greek world is very, very rational. We can thank the Greeks for philosophy and for the philosophy and the way of thinking that eventually planted the seeds for science. Hebrews, on the other hand, express meaning through story and poetry. And one of the problems we have with the Bible is we try to glean a point of a story, which is a rational assumption that there is even a single point. Parables, particularly, have no single point. Religion has also always been expressed through the lens of culture. Thus, there are many kinds of Christianity, historically and even now, colored by cultural habits, assumptions, and practices. I wish I could know more about the Nestorian Christians who made it all the way to China, or the Thomas Christians in India. The legend is that the Apostle Thomas went to India in 45 CE. For a long time, this was disputed because the legend included a king named Gundahara, and there was no evidence of Gundahara in this historical record. But then suddenly, one time in a dig, they found coins bearing the picture of King Gundahara. What were these communities like? Were they rational and doctrinal? Did they write creeds like the Greeks? Or were they poets? Jesus told parables using common things in life. And the stories we've had from Matthew for this morning, they were things like mustard seed, yeast, pearls, treasures, a net. From my perspective, what we need to do is to look around at the common things in our lives and make parables with them. So I offer you, for example, the parable of the automobile. A pastor who had to take the train every day felt trapped inside the train car. He knew the good life had to be on the other side of the hill where the train track did not go. When he had enough money, he bought himself an automobile, and he felt free, and he went wherever he possibly could. But even then, he felt like the good life was still on the other side of the hill. And he found that wherever he went, he was lonely. Can you imagine a parable of a cell phone? This is my challenge to all of you. I would like you to come up with a parable of the cell phone. It's not like there's one definitive parable of the cell phone. Since parables are multivalent, you can come up with many, and many of you can come up with many parables using this common thing in our life. Probably the most common place we can find parables in our lives today, in our culture, is movies. Not all movies function as parables. I would say most do not. I think we often are interested in being entertained more than we are seeking meaning. Can you think of a movie that serves as a parable? I would offer up the movie that I mentioned last week, Little Children by Tom Perrotta. One of my favorite movies that is certainly a parable is an old movie, 1979. Some of us will remember 1979, and the movie is Being There with Peter Sellers and Shirley MacLaine. The story is about Chance the gardener who has spent decades taking care of the garden of a wealthy man in Washington, D.C. He never leaves the property, and all he knows about the world he knows through TV. His benefactor dies, and he is out on the street when he is hit by a car who is driven by an advisor to the president. Chance is nicely dressed, so the advisor takes him for a person of society who is down on his luck. He mishears Chance the gardener for Chauncey Gardner, and he finds him to be direct and wise and insightful. He takes him to meet the president, and when they are talking about stimulating economic growth, Chauncey Gardner starts to talk about stimulating growth in the garden, and everybody takes it as an allegory for the economy and believe him to be brilliant. His words affect foreign policy. There's more to the story than that, but already you can see a parable of deep meaning in the story. Other movies that I think offer parables are Pay It Forward, Gran Torino, Up in the Air, Dead Poets Society, Life and Death of David Gale, American Beauty, Into the Wild, Her. Everybody remember Her, where the guy becomes in love with his avatar? Scent of a Woman, Slumdog Millionaire, The Shawshank Redemption, Beautiful Mind, just to name a few. It doesn't include Transformers or the Avengers of any kind. I came across an article when I was looking for things about parables from the Roman Catholic magazine, The Catechist. The article was entitled, The Parables of and in Our Lives, by Angela Ann Zukowski. She says, parables are meant to ignite imagination. Our imaginations, she says, are shaped by the residue of pictures and images that are stored up as a result of our personal experiences. When we hear a parable that elucidates something common in our life experience, like a car or a cell phone, it stirs up things and images and creates meaning for us that is not abstract or rational. The same thing can be said for people's lives, she says. People's lives can tell a story like a parable, offering insight and truth. So today I'd like to briefly consider the life of recently passed John Lewis. He was the third of 10 children who grew up in a small town in southeast Alabama called Troy. During the first 6 years of his life, he only came into contact with 2 white people. When he was allowed to go to town, he then experienced racism and segregation. He first heard Martin Luther King Jr. on the radio in 1955. He met him when he was 18, and he was determined to spend his life in the civil rights movement. He went to American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, where he earned a degree in religion and philosophy. After last week, I think you remember I mentioned that I studied philosophy and religion, and Marilyn Donahue kindly sent word to let me know that so had John Lewis. In Nashville, he was invited to attend workshops on nonviolence at Clark United Methodist Church under the leadership of James Lawson. I saw James Lawson on one of the news shows just a couple days ago. He's still alive and kicking. He participated in the civil rights movement. He was a freedom rider. He was jailed in Mississippi. He was beat up in South Carolina. He was elected to the House of Representatives at District of Georgia in 1986. Some of the things while in Congress that he was opposed to were the Gulf War, NAFTA, and welfare reform. When welfare reform passed, this was during Clinton's presidency, he said, "Where is the sense of decency? What does it profit a great nation to conquer the world only to lose its soul?" Oh my goodness, would that be words that we could hear today? He did not attend Trump's inauguration, saying that Trump was too much like George Wallace. As a result, he was the victim of a Trump, tweet storm. There is parable in all of this. Can you imagine it? Of course, I take note of the fact that he studied religion and philosophies, and Clark Memorial United Methodist Church, who knew? What I see in this story is a man of great integrity. It's a parable for a black man from rural poor South who only saw two white men until he was 6 to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda, while a white man who knew nothing but privilege and uses it to promote white nationalism sits in the White House facing the indignity of most Americans. That, my friends, is a parable. Likewise, when I was looking around for stuff, I found a book by a woman named Christy Lauren Adams. It's called The Parable of the Brown Girl, The Sacred Lives of Girls of Color. Stories about black girls and the challenges that they face. One of the stories was called The Parable of the Voiceless Brown Girl, a girl named Lyric, who had a deep, monotonous voice. She was relentlessly bullied. People said of her, "You sound like a man." People sent letters to her house suggesting that she should kill herself. There were never consequences from the school for any of these bullying. As an example of systemic racism, if she were white and had received bullying like that, and particularly if she had a mother like a Karen, there would have been consequences. She was diagnosed with bipolar because she was always angry and she had attitude. I know next to nothing about what it's like to grow up black and female in America. I didn't know that often black women are labeled to have attitude. And according to Adams, it has become another racist moniker. She was molested and her mother did not believe her whole life. She felt like she was never heard. Adams writes, "Women's voices have been silenced for centuries." At the end of her story, Lyric realized God had heard her voice all along, concluding her voice was important enough for God's attention, and began a journey to discover how God intended to use her voice. These stories are full of meaning through parable. Zukowski, the one who wrote the book, the article about the parables of our lives, believes that it's very hard for us to get in touch with our parables of our lives because we are a culture of distraction. Can you imagine what that means? A culture of distraction? Our attention can go quickly from one thing to another, leaving no empty space. We often get captivated by screens and media. Look around. Whenever there's an idle moment, people turn to a screen. We are losing our ability to be open and aware. When everything is shown to us, we don't have to exercise our imaginations. We take things at face value in life, and then we take the Bible at face value. What is a parable at face value? What is a life at face value? When we look at a thing at face value, we are going to see things definitively and not generatively. Parables are not meant to define anything. They are meant to stimulate our imagination and evoke our faith, open our awareness to the world around us so that we might see God in the most surprising of places. Parables are not definite. They are, for example, what kind of parables could we come up with common materials in our lives, the cars, TV, soft and hardware, email and Amazon, financial stimulus, health insurance, schools, school debt, think tanks, media, and of course Reddit and YouTube. I think you get the idea, and I'll be waiting for your parable of the cell phone. What are the parables in our lives? I see so many people living face value lives, unimaginative lives, lives bound by a closed book belief system and creeds that chill, distracted lives without poetry or parable, entertained lives that are ignorant of meaning. We are not called just to believe Jesus on Sunday. Our lives are called to live with imagination and faith every day of the week, every month of the year, every moment, no matter how painful or challenging. We are called to live with open hearts and open minds, loving habits and practices, and to be aware of what and who is around us, to reach out to anyone who's disenfranchised. We're called to speak the truth to power, to follow Jesus into the darkest of places with our light lit. We're called to discern the lives and parables of our lives, the stories, the beatitudes of our lives, and to hear those of others. To consider our lives as lives that are not just a series of events, but more like stories and parables that convey meaning. The Bible is generative. It's not definitive. The Bible isn't meant to define faith, but to generate faith. The Bible isn't meant to collect beliefs, but to evoke a way of seeing and living in the world. Amen.